Hello, my name is Sammy Cowger, and this is my personal reflection one on performance-enhancing drugs in professional sport. So the article that I chose to really focus my statement around of that I don't think performance-enhancing drugs should be legalized or even talked about in professional sport is called "The Ripples Are Big: Storytelling and Impact of Doping in Sport Beyond the Sanctioned Athlete." Kelsey Erickson, Susan Backhouse, and David Careless compiled this article, and it takes a pretty unique focus on kind of proving and showing the negative effects of performance-enhancing drugs in sport. And I like that. It kind of shows the opposite side of not just focusing on the athletes that do it, but also the athletes that don't and how they're affected, because I think that's one of the really big things for me ethically is the pressure that it would place on all athletes to take it and the unlevel playing field that it would create. So in this article, they go through a couple different studies, and the main one is a track and field athlete who talks about his experience with this, and he talks about how he was ethically opposed to it and never wanted to take performance-enhancing drugs. They start out talking about, I love this, kind of when he was 8 years old, his track coach asked him what his dream was, and it was to win the Olympics. And so, like any aspiring athlete, he had those big goals, and he wanted to do whatever it took to get there. But ethically, he wanted to stay within those bounds. So as he got older and those dreams were really in his sights, he talked about a couple instances where he was really close or he almost made the cut and he didn't. And then it started to come out that some of the athletes that beat him and qualified above him were taking these drugs. And he talked about kind of just the emotional roller coaster that took him on, as not only is that not fair, but like maybe I should have done that. Like if I was really committed to winning, why didn't I do anything possible? And then he would have to talk himself back of like, no, that's not ethical. But just kind of that frustration of you showing up to the line and you never know what the people next to you have done to prepare legal or illegal. And then he talked about even if they were legal, that's not something he would want to do. And I mean, that's his choice. No athlete should feel pressured into taking anything that they don't want to. And I think that's part of the issue with legalizing it is just the options and the pressure that the athletes feel to be the best. And so just kind of to summarize that article, they also follow a soccer player who decided not to go to the World Cup because of the doping testing and the uncertainty around that and the fact that they would have to travel to another country and the ramifications of you never know what's going to happen with the drug test and doctoring and things like that. So I think there's a lot of ramifications, not just around the athletes that are taking it, because obviously the physical issues are there. I know in an article by Marvelous and Donna called The Adverse Effects of Steroids in Athletes, a Constant Threat, they do talk about those physical things, which are one of the easier things to outline because it's measurable. And I know they haven't done a lot of long-term studies on the physical effects of that, but things like liver and heart function decrease, reproductive function decreases with the use of this. It can disrupt growth if you take it from too young of an age. It stunts your growth. It kind of throws things off there, just the hormonal imbalance. So I think those physical implications are bad, but you also have to look at, is that really kind of at the forefront of the athletes' minds? Another interesting article I found was called The Psychology Behind Doping in Sport. I think that's pretty important to look at because obviously with ethics, with legal ethics like this where it's illegal and it's stated pretty clearly that these are banned substances, people are still taking it. So it's important for us as professionals to understand why is this happening, kind of why is that cost-benefit analysis giving the athletes a gray area that they feel they can operate in, and or some will take it and some won't. Kind of what is the psychology behind that? So they did a couple interesting studies and surveys of athletes. So they looked at 100 different athletes and they surveyed them. And some of the reasons they got for why not doping were different things like doping is cheating, not fair play. They mentioned some of the medical risk, which is pretty standard. They brought lawyers into the sporting world. Some didn't like that. Destroys the image of sport, which is one that I'm also a firm believer in, and I'll touch on a little later. But I think the more interesting piece of that was the win-at-all-cost mentality that they go into studies. So those are the athletes that said they would never do it, and then they looked at the athletes that said that they would. So they surveyed 100 athletes. So even the ones that said that they wouldn't consider doping, they were given the hypothetical situation that If you were 100% certain you would not be caught and you were 100% certain that you would win, would you take performance-enhancing drugs or illegal substances? And 98% of those athletes said yes. So the issue of getting caught is really kind of what swayed them there. Then they were asked a second question of, you will win every competition you enter for the next 5 years, but then will die based on the side effects. And 50% said yes to that question. So that just proves that the physical and legal ramifications do have different weights of it, and you're still going to have a 50-50 percentage of the athletes that don't care about the physical ramifications, which is really scary. That win at all costs mentality is something culturally that we really need to focus on, and we really need to know that if this is something that we're going to prove to be legal, or if we're going to change the legislation around that, we have to understand the ramifications. That if 50% of the athletes are still saying that they don't care about the physical effects, that's not going to change with legislation. And it's really our job to protect our athletes and protect the integrity of the people. And when we're placing pressure on these athletes to perform and win, we also have to understand that with that kind of narrows their mentality of what is right and wrong. And if they see that they have a responsibility to fill, and they think these drugs, harmful or not, will get them there, it's going to be pretty tempting to say no to that. And I think that's a really scary thing. And personally, I just think performance-enhancing drugs really change kind of the integrity and the beauty of sport. I've always loved that sport kind of erases background, and that it doesn't matter where you come from, it just matters your skill set and whether you play. And I think economic discrepancies have come up of training facilities and resources that are available, and that kind of makes the playing field unequal. And I think allowing substances, performance-enhancing drugs, would just further that gap of, obviously, even if they were all legalized, they would still cost money, and there would still be athletes that wouldn't have access to them, and it would just further that gap of the haves and the have-nots of sport. And I think that's one of the things that have been great about sport. It provides a platform for people to work really hard, and it kind of takes that financial aspect out of it, where if you put in the work, you're going to be successful. And I think allowing drugs to be a factor in that would really take away from the integrity of the sport and different things like that. So I really don't think PEDs should be used in professional sport. And kind of, so chapter 16 of the textbook talks about this as well, that it's not just steroids. I know that's an easy thing in the era of Barry Bonds and Lance Armstrong. I know growing up, those were the big issues around me. Steroids aren't the only drug that do this, and there's a ton of banned substances, and I am a firm believer in they're banned for very specific reasons. And while the list is really long, I know I played college sports, and I couldn't tell you what is okay and not okay, and I think a lot of athletes are in that boat. But just that educational piece of being health educators, we have a responsibility to understand those and communicate them to our athletes. And so, I mean, those articles really tie it together, but bringing it back to the main one that I was touching on, of just that, the psychology behind it of what are we doing, what are we valuing with our athletes, are we really going to take this win at all cost type mentality? And then looking at the impact of everybody. If an athlete wants to be the best and wants to perform, they shouldn't have to be pressured into taking drugs to do so. And I think culturally that's a responsibility that we have to bear. And yes, it's going to be a tough thing and it's hard to regulate, but I also think if it's legalized, it's just as hard to regulate. So kind of putting a foot down and having some consistency in the different bans and different things we can do would really make a big impact. And just kind of that standardized and making sure that while athletics are purely, like, people love them for entertainment, looking at the athletes as people and not as just means of entertainment or getting a result or maintaining a livelihood through financial gain, but really looking at the big picture of the physical implications and the mental implications that we're putting these stress on these athletes to perform, and is that really the healthiest thing in the world? And then eventually, like, you legalize one thing, it's really hard to draw the line then. Once all the athletes are starting to take performance-enhancing drugs, they're always going to be seeking the next cutting-edge advantage. And if you just keep legalizing that, it's really hard to know where the line is drawn in a world where we already have very strong issues with concussions and physical injuries. Just making the athletes bigger and stronger is not going to help that. And I think there's a lot of implications around it, and there's a lot more negative than positive in creating a culture around that. So I'm confidently able to stand behind the fact that I don't believe performance-enhancing drugs should be legalized in professional or any level of sport for that matter.